Today we're down here in my basement, which is not ideal, but we're down here because I wanted to share with you, first of all, my vermicompost bins, which unfortunately are going to be leaving me soon, so I'm also going to share with you how to build a really easy, low-cost bin to replace these two. So the story with these bins is these were bought by the school I work at. And when we went into lockdown for the pandemic, I had to take these home with me to keep them fed, keep them going, because vermiculture relies on living organisms. That is to say, red wiggler worms to eat your food waste. The red wiggler, it's sort of a generic term for many species of worm, usually the species Eisenia fetida. Okay, so these are really nice worm towers. This one's called the Worm Factory. And I've really enjoyed having them. They work extremely well. The idea is, it works on a tiered system. So I'd fill up this bottom tier. Once it was full, I add the next tier, and each tier has a perforated bottom. This goes with how Eisenia fetida like to feed in the wild. Right? These are what we call composting worms. Right? They fit the name perfectly. They tend to live in the very shallow portion of the soil, and as leaf litter falls on the soil, they eat their way up and get rid of all that forest waste on the ground. So we're going to take advantage of that tendency and have them eat their way up. So by adding these tiers and adding food waste into subsequent tiers, they're going to eat their way up into the new tiers. By the time they get to the top tier, the bottom tier is fully digested and composted into beautiful worm castings. That's what we call worm poo. That's the fancy name. It sounds better than poo, I guess. We call it worm castings, which is an incredibly nutritious soil. All the worms have moved to the top. Then we take this, we empty this into the bucket so I can add that to my garden. This becomes the top tier, and then we just constantly rotate. Now, to be honest, 2 bins is probably too much for my household. I was constantly spreading the wealth as best I could to keep the worms going, keep the worms alive, because the worms will eat their own weight every day. So we started each of these bins with a pound of worms. So that's 2 pounds of food waste every day. That's a lot. So I was constantly managing that food load. The other thing that's nice about these is it has a drain spigot, right? So I just fill out this container each time as the liquid drains to that bottom tray and gets emptied. If things are managed perfectly, there shouldn't be a whole lot of water coming out of there, but it is nice to have that outlet. And then my little milk container, this is called leachate. Can be a very potent fertilizer. This has to be diluted with water to use in the garden. All right, so I do need to replace these now because, at least theoretically, we're going back to school next month, which means the worms are coming with me and each is going to go into their own classroom. I still want to be able to generate some of that beautiful compost here at home, so I'm going to make my own worm bin here. Much less low-tech, easier to manage, easier to build version of these. Okay, these cost about $150 each, so it was very nice of the school to buy them. Got it all set up with my environmental science classes last year, and it was ready to go. Kids were able to bring in their food waste from their lunches, apple cores, banana peels, things like that, and put them right in here. So there's plenty of food for them. But now they're going to go back to that life at school, so I need something here at home that I can run and get rid of my food waste here. And this will be great because it will be taking care of some food waste at school, taking care of some food waste here. That's a lot of stuff not going into landfills, and hopefully going into beautiful gardens. So let me walk you through how to make one of these bins now. Should be very easy. And then over time we'll make some more videos and I'll show you how they're being fed, how those worms are surviving. Okay, so what you need for your homemade bin is pretty darn simple. I just got a couple of these plastic bins from a big box hardware store. I think they were $5 a piece. So compared to the $150 for the fancy bin, this is much lower cost. But it's also going to be a little harder to manage. All right, but it's kind of a give and take. All right, so we're kind of mimicking the same concept, only with one tier. Right, so the bottom tray is going to be catching all the liquids, if there are any additional liquids. This is going to be the feeding tray where the worms are going to live. Alright, so the first step I need to do is take this top bin. First I want to drill some drain holes in it. Okay, then around the top, on the sides, I'm going to drill some air holes in it. So here's my top bin. The first thing I'm going to be doing is using a relatively large drill bit, and at these lowest points, drilling drain holes. Now there's a catch-22 here. The worms can go through some of these holes, so I'm going to have to keep an eye out for that. But what I'm going to be relying on is their natural tendency to eat their way up. So once this thing gets relatively full, they shouldn't have to worry so much about them crawling through these holes. Same thing is true of the air holes. I'm going to be using a much smaller drill bit around the side, and that's for two reasons. First of all, again, I don't want the worms crawling out, but I do want to provide them with enough air. Second of all, worms don't like light, right? So I'm not going to be drilling any air holes on the top where they're more likely to be impacted by direct light. But even from the sides here, I don't want a ton of light getting in, so I'm going to be using a very small drill bit around the sides to drill the air holes. All right, so I'm going to drill those holes, show you how to set up the inside of the bin when I'm done. Okay, so the holes are drilled. I just used a cordless drill first using a very small drill bit for the air holes around the top edge here, and then the larger holes at the four corners at the lowest point. This will be for the liquid to drain, this will be for the air. Now, one thing I did forget to mention, when you drill the holes in, it's going to leave sharp edges around the inside. I used a small sanding block to grind those away. One thing to keep in mind, worms have what we call hydrostatic skeletons. Or hydro meaning water, static meaning to keep in place. Everything is held in place by water pressure. So imagine if your body was a water balloon. Right? Any cut or scratch would be catastrophic. You would just burst. Worms are very much the same way. The slightest scratch can cause a lot of damage to them. So I wanted to get rid of all those sharp edges around the inside using a sander. One way to avoid that, if you want to get fancy, if you have a very small Phillips screwdriver, you can just heat the tip and melt the holes through. Okay, and that will avoid those sharp edges. But it's very easy just to sand them away if you don't want to carry around a sharp, pointy, hot object. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get the bedding set up. This is going to be the base layer where the worms are going to live. Alright, so now we're going to put the bedding material, and for the beginning of these worms' lives in their new home, this is going to be where they live. The bedding material I'm making is of two substances. I've just got some shredded newspaper and some torn up cardboard. Any cardboard will do. The cardboard I prefer to use is what's called molded cardboard. It's the kind you see in egg crates like this. It tends to absorb a lot more moisture, I find, than what we would have like corrugated cardboard, where cardboard boxes are made out of. Plus, corrugated cardboard is a very recyclable material as opposed to this molded stuff, which has already most likely been through one recycling life cycle. So it's much less sturdy, which is one of the reasons why it's more absorbent. So I prefer to use this kind of cardboard if it's available, but any kind of cardboard will work as long as all the tape and glue is removed. You don't want any of that ending up in your bin. Okay, so I did end up, fortunately, I have a whole stack of these. A neighbor of ours got a huge wine shipment and just left these on the curb for garbage pickup, so I have a ton of these wine boxes that are made out of the same molded material. So I have no shortage of molded cardboard. Okay, so I've got my shredded newspaper with some molded cardboard. I'm going to start putting that in the box. And as I do so, I'm just going to spray it lightly to keep it wet and moist, because they're going to need that moist environment. Remember, it's back to that hydrostatic skeleton. They need a ready supply of water to keep themselves inflated and robust. So I'm going to add in the bedding material, spray it with some water, and then I'll show you getting the worms in there. Before I wet this down, I wanted to show you approximately how deep I have it to start with. So it's about 3 inches of newspaper and cardboard mixed before I wet it down. Now, to be clear, you can use almost any high carbon substance for this step. You could go in your backyard and shovel in some soil. That's where worms live anyway. I like this looser stuff. I think it's easier to manage. But you can just fill this up with potting soil, get a bag of soil from a nursery, anything like that will do. This was readily available and this was free. So I went with this. All right, let me show you how wet it ought to be by the time you're ready to put your worms in. So I'm just going to spray it lightly. Okay, this is a clean spray bottle that has not been used for anything else. You want to be very clear about that. You don't want to use, obviously, a spray bottle that's been used for any sort of cleaning product or vinegar, anything like that you'd use a spray bottle for around the house. This is brand new, not been used for anything else. Okay, so I want it just damp. Right? I don't want it to be dripping wet. And in fact, one test you can do, if you pick up the paper and you squeeze it, if any drops of water come out of it, you've gotten it too wet, add some more newspaper or cardboard in to absorb some of that moisture. Okay, and in fact, I'm just going to add a little bit more, and then we'll be ready to introduce our worms. All right, so here are some worms that I harvested from the worm factory bins. It's not a ton of worms. I didn't want to decimate those populations. I want those to still be functional bins. Okay, so you can see the worms throughout the old, I had the same exact bedding in those old bins, worms throughout. But it's, usually you want to start with about a pound of worms. I don't have nearly that many, so I'm going to have to feed them very small amounts of food to start with until that population starts growing. Now the population will grow approximately double every 60 to 90 days, depending on the food source and how happy and healthy they are. All right, so that population is going to grow pretty quickly. Okay, so I'm going to get them into their new home, let them settle in. Okay, just kind of spread them out. Okay. Okay, and I'm going to let them settle in here for a little bit before I feed them anything new. There is still some bits of food in here from the old bin, so that should keep them going for a while and everything's nice and moist. Okay, so it'll probably be a few days before I give them any new food. And again, at first it's not going to be pounds of food, it's going to be ounces of food. The last thing you want to do is overfeed the bin. That's when things start to degrade and get funky and smelly and gross. If the things are running well in here, if everything's in balance, and make sure I don't leave any worms behind. If everything's in balance, your worm bin, when all is said and done, should smell like dirt. If things start to smell bad, something's going wrong. Either there's too much moisture and things have gone anaerobic and started to degrade in a swampy, smelly sort of way, or you've put too much food in and it's starting to rot instead of being eaten by the worms. Better to underfeed the worms than overfeed the worms, because you could always add a little bit more food if you need to. Getting gross food out of there to try and rebalance things is a little bit more difficult. So always skew low instead of skewing high when it comes to adding food. Now the types of food you can add in here are pretty much any vegetable or fruit waste. Your chopped up lettuce ends, the ends of your carrots. The finer you chop them up, the better. And I'll show you a little clip of me feeding them and how I'm going to manage this in a later video. Now one thing I do want to add into here, and this is a very important step. Okay, I did a video on how to reuse eggshells. Okay, here are my powdered eggshells, and I'm going to add a bit of this into the bin. Okay, so the reason I need to do this is because worms don't have teeth, right? They still need to grind up that food though, so they have a organ similar to a bird's gizzard, right? If you ever see chickens eating in a chicken yard, they pick up little pieces of gravel, swallow those down into their gizzard, and that acts to grind up the food on the way down to their stomach. These worms have something similar called a crop, and they need little pieces of grit just like the birds do in order to grind up their food before it gets to their stomach. Now I'm kind of doing double duty here. By using eggshell instead of sand or even soil from the yard, I'm also adding some micronutrients. So when this is done as a fertilizer, it's going to have a lot of cool micronutrients in it from the eggshells as well. It also is going to help balance this. If I start putting small amounts of coffee grounds, which tend to be a little bit acidic, the calcium carbonate from the eggshells will balance that pH for me. Worms have a natural mechanism to deacidify their food. They will extrude calcium carbonate in their saliva that will neutralize any acids. Right? Similar to being cut, being acidified is very dangerous when you have a hydrostatic skeleton. So we're going to use eggshells instead of sand, and it's going to serve a lot of purposes for us. So every time I add a little bit of food, I just sprinkle in some of those eggshells, and it'll be great. Okay, the next video I show you guys will be me feeding the worms and showing you how I'm going to manage this bin, but that will be in a later video. Last but not least, this is our second bin. Now nothing needs to be done to this bin. This is the bin that's going to catch all the drippings, all the leachate that comes out through the bottom of our primary bin. Now at the bottom of this, I simply have a little riser. This is an old takeout container. And I'm just going to put that at the bottom to give some space between our housing bin, for lack of a better way of putting that, and our catch bin. Okay, so I'm just going to put the worm bin in there. All right. And now periodically I'm going to have to check in here to see if there are any fluids. Now, to be perfectly clear, you don't have to have this second bin, right? If you don't drill any holes in the bottom, everything will stay in this top bin. You just have to be very careful about managing the moisture. Constantly checking, doing that squeeze test, hopefully without any worms in that handful, and making sure you don't get any water dripping out of your hand. If you do, add some more of that batting material to absorb that moisture. Okay, so it is possible to do this with just one bin. But then what you have is what's called a closed environment. And if anything goes wrong, there's no outlet. So I do like to have a little backup. I will be trying to manage it as best I can to minimize that moisture. But if something goes wrong, if I mess up, if I add too much wet stuff, I do want to have this outlet. It's sort of in case of emergency. Okay, last but not least, I'm just going to close it up. Again, you don't want to leave this open. The worms do not like light, right? They have evolved to move away from light, so that's going to lock down. They're going to stay nice and cozy in there. This time of year, I am going to keep this indoors. During fall and spring, it is possible to move this outdoors. But in the very heat of summer or in the very cold of winter, you're probably going to want to keep this indoors. Okay, so that's it for setting up a very basic worm bin. I will update you in future videos to see how it's going, how they get fed, and ultimately how I'm going to harvest the worm castings, right? I don't have this very fancy system any longer where I can just remove a tray and collect the castings. I'm going to have to get a little inventive to collect the castings from a single bin system. But I do have some ideas that I'm eager to try out. All right, so those will be in future videos. Otherwise, thank you for watching and have a good New Year's.